island 33 miles long and 13 miles wide, the Isle of Man has no less than 4 heritage railways and tramways, but only one railway on the island carries the mantle of being solely electric. The Isle of Man has always been a stunning tourist trap. The Port of Douglas was thriving and was full of hotels and tourist facilities, everything the weary traveller would require. But the town was a little too successful, and it was getting harder and harder to compete for business. Businessman Alexander Bruce and his business partner, civil engineer Frederick Saunderson, wanted to join in on the venture, but with lots of businesses established, they decided on a largely untouched patch of land to the town's north, and with it they proposed a new leisure and pleasure complex. After plans were drawn up, the lands were purchased and approval given as long as a new road with a new seawall was built. But to get the passengers from the town to the new resort, the partners didn't just want to use the road, so approval included permission to lay a tramway alongside the road. There was no restriction on the power though, so the partners had the luxury of choice. The mainstream choice was either steam or horsepower, but with the world obsessed with electrical design and gadgets, it was felt that the tramway too needed to be in with the times. It had to be electric as well. By the time everything was ready to go, word had spread of the men's venture. The next estate over had access to Groudle Glen, a beautiful glen with a meandering stream, ideal for tourists to take in nature. The estate's owner wanted in and wanted to build an additional hotel and quickly snapped up the land to enable the railway to make it to their hotel's doorstep. Work started in 1893 when a new company called the Douglas Bay Estate Limited was born. Its primary goal was the estate's transport links, but more focus was put on the new railway rather than the road. Experts from the mainland railways were brought in as consultants to ensure the railway's success. A new depot and power plant was constructed at Porta Vada. The new depot included everything the trams needed to keep them running. The workshop would hold 9 cars comfortably over 3 tracks and inspection pits. A boiler house would power the depot and was named Derby Castle in honour of a private dwelling nearby. Due to the smaller 3-foot gauge and its location, the depot was equipped with everything needed to maintain and repair the engines and cars. At the same time, the last of the rails were being laid and overhead power cables were being put in to supply the power and fed into place. Now all that was needed was the engines. 3 brand new bespoke saloon cars with 6 open trailers were welcomed to the island from their build place of Birkenhead in August of 1893. After a few tests to rid the engines of any gremlins, the railway was ready to take passengers within weeks of the engine's arrival. The railway opened officially on the 7th of September. It was late in the season, and the railway only saw 17 days of operation that year before the island's annual winter shutdown. But the railway still carried more than 1,000 people a day, all eager to try this new mode of power. But Alexander Bruce was already looking at the railway's future. Although the railway had been open for less than a month, he knew he was already onto a roaring success. He approached the Manx government for approval to an extension that the company had been planning even before the first rails had been laid. The Douglas Talaxi Tramway Company was formed, and the company gained universal approval, and land was purchased along the route ready to take the trains. The route would go over the Groudle River, so a viaduct was built, and Derby Castle got a mega upgrade to take the extra cars. The town of Laxey welcomed the tramway and worked on their own attractions to welcome their guests. With the new extension also came a new name, the Isle of Man Tramways and Electric Power Company Limited. The company's web of rails would soon reach south of the town of Douglas, and soon the majority of the town was reachable by tram. The first full year of trading was promising. Each tramway ran independently under its own name, but each railway fed into the Isle of Man Tramway and Electric Power Company. Derby Castle was expanded, yet again, to facilitate more cars, but in less than 2 years the railway was ready to expand again. This time the goal was to reach Ramsey. It would be the longest extension they would ever propose, and because of its length, a 2-step approach was required. One gang would start from Ballow east of the town, while the other worked north from Laxley. It took 2 years to complete, and the new line was opened to the masses on the 24th of July, 1899. While from the outside, things were looking rosy, under the hood, there were some big problems. To build all this great railway, the company took some rather large loans. One of the largest was held by Dumbbell's Bank. The bank could not afford the loan, so the loan was underwritten by Parr's Bank of England. In 1900, Parr's foreclosed on the loan, and although the company was paying the loan back, it wasn't enough. Neither Dumbbell's Bank or the railway was not able to pay it all back, so with no other option, the bank collapsed. The bank's demise spelt disaster for the island. Thousands of pounds in savings were wiped out, and the common consumer suffered as a result. The people turned against Bruce, the inventor of the railway. It was his idea for the extensions, his idea for the loans, and he had earlier resigned and left the railway to its fate when the banks came knocking. He passed away later that year. Feeling cheated, the island's inhabitants had no choice but to turn back to the railway to see what could be done. There was a real threat that liquidation was on the table, but it was decided to sell the company to raise the money. The Douglas horse and cable tramways were sold for £50,000, but in 1902 a new offer of £250,000 was received from a merchant banker. The banker was part of a syndicate and bought all of the individual companies and lines and facilities under a new name, Manx Electric Railway. With the exception of the horse tramway, almost everything that had been sold by the railway to gain money had been repurchased, and the railway looked set to be the dominant mode of transport around the island once again. From the sale, the railway prospered and grew, but they, like many others, suffered financially during the war years. The only infrastructure they lost was a refreshment room due to an unrelated fire, but the interim war years saw passengers' numbers bounce to new heights. 1930, however, was a year the railway wanted to forget. It started in the spring when a fire spread through the carriage shed at Laxey, most likely caused by a discarded cigarette. The fire caused significant damage and 15 vehicles were lost. The shed was rebuilt and 3 new cars ordered, but it would not replace the sentimental and historic loss. The railway's woes deepened in September when the entire Laxey area flooded during a storm. The weir at the power station caused the river to burst its banks and run down the main road instead, flooding nearly the whole village. The railway, shamefaced, was forced to pay tens of thousands of pounds in compensation, but despite this and the impending war, passengers were still flocking to the railway and any debts were starting to be erased. After the Second World War, the railway was moving on average 750,000 passengers yearly. But the 1950s saw a big change in people's perceptions to holidays. People were going abroad by plane or taking the road, and coaches and railways were seeing a decline. The railway could literally not afford to see its passenger numbers go down. The cars and trucks were ageing and in need of desperate repair. By 1955, the MER directors had all come to the same conclusion. They simply couldn't run anymore, and the railway would have to be sold. Its price? Scrap value. But an expert team comprising of members of British Rail examined the railway and concluded that the railway was a treasure and should be preserved. With no more private money, it was decided to nationalise the railway, and in 1957 the railway was handed over to the public. Money was earmarked for the railway's revival and work began. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The new management brought in new rules and timetables, something locals were not best pleased about. The fares had increased as well, thanks to higher than anticipated running costs, but no amount of rebudgeting could save the Laxey to Ramsey section of the railway. It closed in 1975, taking with it the railway's mail contract. It was hotly debated, and it was decided to reopen the branch 2 years later. It was a good time too, as the 100th anniversary of the railways was around the corner. The railway had gone from being a tourist conveyance to a tourist attraction in its own right. Stock that was rotting away was lovingly restored and displayed. A new museum was opened displaying the preserved cars, and a huge gala was held to celebrate. A few years later, the railway joined with the National Transport Board to become the Isle of Man Passenger Transport Board. More focus was on heritage and preservation rather than modernisation. The railway is still under public control today, overseen by the Department of Tourism and Transport following the board system being scrapped in the mid-80s. In 2008, following safety concerns on the permanent way, it was decided to close the Laxley to Ramsey branch again. Once again, locals were furious and would not believe that a public-funded railway would get in that bad of a state. It was repaired a year later and is thankfully still running today. One of the most unique aspects of this railway is that it runs, to this day, with its original rolling stock. Apart from number 22, which is a replica following a fire, as all the stock is operational, it makes for quite a sight on the island. Some cars, due to their rarity and their value, are seldom used, but are occasionally out and about on special occasions, and it's the oldest tram line with its original stock anywhere in the world.